Hey guys, this is AP World History, Chapter 34, An Age of Anxiety. Okay guys, so this chapter pretty much is going to be what we call the interwar years, meaning that it's the period between World War I and World War II. And it's going to look at what happened because of World War I and going to also look at how World War II is starting. How did these fascist regimes like that of Adolf Hitler, that of Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, how did they come into power and kind of set the stage for World War II? So let's go ahead and get started. So probing cultural frontiers. Um, After World War One, it was shocking to everybody. I mean, World War One was this war that it was almost inevitable to happen, but the repercussions of it made everybody question whether what was happening, what they did, the choices they made before the war were correct. So you see a lot of uncertainty that is happening, and we see it especially with religion. It's this chorus of despair. With Karl Barth, he was a Christian theologian. He attacked liberal Christians who called for progress. He said, well, if it wasn't for you guys wanting to move forward, wanting to make developments, then this war would have never started. And he also argued that he said Christ's kingdom is not of this world, meaning that us trying to make this progress is never going to lead us to the kingdom of God. That it's not of this world. It's not here on earth. And then there was the refusal to accept God's purpose was a contemporary for human society, meaning that we're not accepting what God wants us to do as humans. You also see after World War I an attack on progress. The Great War, also known as World War I, destroyed the idea of human progress. The idea that here we are trying to again make these developments and the scientist dreams go awry in wanting to help humanity. Scientists wanted to, help humanity, be there for humanity, but in the end, they're developing, chemical gases, poison gases. They're developing bombs. They're developing, new military weaponry, and that was not necessarily what they wanted to do. We also see the argument that democracy was a fallen idol, saying, we pushed for this democracy through our revolutions, through our American Revolution, through our French Revolution, through the unifications that we saw for the nations, and look at where it got us. It got us into a war that devastated, a whole continent. So it's again the idea also of it's a product of decay, that there were no positive values that were coming from democracy, and that some people said, you know what, maybe we should go back to that elite rule where one person is in charge, because when one person was in charge, there was never this mass destruction. So that was some of the sentiment that people were feeling during this time. With that, we also see revolutions in physics and psychology. You have something called the uncertainty principle, and this was by Werner Heisenberg. At first, it was like a physics idea that kind of transferred into something more social. So essentially, scientists cannot observe the behavior of an electron objectively. That was the scientific theory of it. But then it got pushed further into something that was known as the uncertainty principle. And what it was that objectivity was not a valid concept, meaning that you cannot be objective. There's no such thing as objectivity because the observer was a part of the process. You, just by you watching what's going on, you have already defeated the purpose of being objective because you have already changed the environment by you being in there. We also see Sigmund Freud come into play, Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and he challenged the concepts of morality and values. He said that there's always a conflict between your conscious and your unconscious mental process, and that we use repressive mechanisms. And these dreams that we have lead to the deepest parts of your mind, that dreams can reveal a lot about who we are as people. And there was something he came up with also called the Oedipus complex, that young male boys favored their mothers and they hated their fathers. That was what the Oedipus complex was. So this led to all this psychoanalysis is going to be one of the main things that leads to the field of psychiatry. All right. And it was, again, the understanding of human behavior. Why are we acting the way we do? How are our actions telling us something about ourselves or not telling us something that we don't know? After World War One, we also see experimentation in art and architecture. A lot of artistic influences begin, not a reproduction of reality, but an end in and of itself. So essentially, people are kind of showing what their version of reality is. And a lot of this inspiration for these new types of styles and techniques in art come from Asian Pacific and African societies. We see Edgar Degas, one of the artists. He focused on visual angles and asymmetrical compositions. Paul Gauguin was inspired by primitive art and held wonder was not in a civilized society, pretty much saying, looking after everything that's happened in World War One, we as people are not civilized. People who are more primitive than us are more civilized than us. And then, of course, Pablo Picasso, his practice of cubism, that came from him being influenced by African art. In terms of architecture, we have the Bauhaus Institution. It was an architectural institution, and it really focused on urban and industrial landscape. And its primary focus was functional design. The idea that the spaces that we create, they are going to be for a purpose, and they're going to be used, but they can also be designed to be aesthetically appealing. So Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, he was one of the directors of Bauhaus, and he was the one who came up with the glass box skyscrapers. And of course, you guys see these everywhere. If you go to New York City, there are those huge skyscrapers that are, all made of glass. And the idea was that he wanted to kind of move this into like neighborhoods, but for many people, they felt that type of architecture was just too cold for the purpose of being in a neighborhood. So it mainly stayed in the city. So that's essentially what's going on in terms of culture and society after World War One. Economically, we see the global depression occur, and it's very important to note that within the global depression is the Great Depression. However, it really is what it sounds like. It's a global depression in that everyone in the world pretty much is affected by it. So, the Great Depression, the economic problems, is that we have a tangled financial system. After World War One, we have people borrowing money to pay off other people to pay back somebody else. So essentially, the Allies had war debts. They had reparations to be paid by Germany and Austria, and the US essentially funded the war. So, how are we going to pay money back, essentially? So, what was happening is that Austria and Germany were relying on the United States for loans. So, Austria and Germany are taking loans out from the US, and they're using those loans to pay France and England. Okay, and then France and England, they owed money to the US. So, France and England, they would get their payments of loans from Austria and Germany, and they use that money and pay it back to the US. So, if you're following me here, money is just going in a circle, meaning money is not being created, it's just being moved around. So, there's no growth, there's no economic growth. So, in 1929, US lenders began to withdraw capital from Europe. So, essentially saying, you know what, we're going to take out money from Europe. But again, remember, Europe is borrowing money to pay the US off. So, there really is no profit there, no capital there to pull from, and it's going to create this economic strain on Europe. In addition to this, we also see poor agricultural based on overproduction and failing prices. And the reason for this is that when the war was going on, you needed to, overproduce in farming, in agriculture, because you had to go and help the soldiers off in the war. When the war ended, you still had this overproduction, but nobody was buying. So again, that means that you're going to have to drop the price to kind of get rid of that excess amount of goods that you have. The crash of 1929, the U.S. after World War I will enjoy a boom And it really is inflated. It's superficial. The United States will see the introduction of credit, and a lot of people will buy things on credit so they can, kind of just um, keep up with everybody else who is also enjoying these goods. And this is going to hurt them because it's not real money that they have. You're pretty much borrowing money. Another thing that leads to the crash of 1929 is this thing called speculative ventures. And so what people were doing were they were, purchasing a stock, but they only had to put 3% down on the stock, and then they'd have a banker kind of invest the rest of it. So essentially, they began to realize that stock prices were overvalued and investors tried to pull out their money, but there was no money in there because of how they worked the system. So it's going to lead to a huge crash. So right here, just to kind of show you, here's the high point, and then when the crash occurs, this is the low point. And then there's going to be some recovery after the crash, but then for the following years, you see this is the Great Depression right here. So it really hurts the U.S. economy, and in turn, it will hurt the rest of the world. So the economic contraction spreads, and we see a decrease in business activity, wages, and employment. Obviously, if you don't have money, then you don't have money to buy goods. You don't have money to pay your employees. And you could not sell inventory. So again, you have to cut back and lay off your employees as well. The national income is going to drop by half, as you see in this graph here. And then 44% of the US banks will go out of business because they had nothing to back themselves up with. And so we have a hurting US economy that was felt all over the world. So industrial economies, investors were shaken by the crash, and they tried to liquidate and take out loans, but people were not going to lend loans to somebody who had lost their job, who was considered a risk. They weren't going to lend them the loans. And if you're trying to liquidate your goods, meaning you're trying to get rid of and sell all your goods, nobody's going to buy because nobody has money to buy. So none of that was effective. Germany experiences economic slide also due to the U.S. Again, remember, they're trying to borrow from the U.S., but now the U.S. is struggling itself, so it makes that difficult, and it's going to affect Germany. Foreign trade falls, causing the losses in manufacturing, employment, and per capita. Remember, people are trying to import goods over here. I'm trying to export goods over here to the U.S., but again, if there's no money, how can we bring them in? So what do you do when there's this problem? Something called economic nationalism took effect. So the Great Depression destroyed international and financial commercial networks of capitalist economies, and countries began to focus on this thing called economic nationalism, which essentially were tariff barriers. So taxes, you couldn't bring in without being taxed a high price. You could only import so many goods. You could only have so many goods brought in as well, in terms of which kinds of goods would be brought in. And the U.S. thought this is going to work. This is what's going to help us get out of this. And essentially this backfires because other countries say, oh, well, you're going to tax us. You're going to limit our goods into your country. Well, we're going to do the same to you. You also had something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and what that did was it raised duties on most manufactured products to prohibitive levels. So it was just an extremely high tax that didn't work. And other nations, like I said, will strike back, and drop in trade will occur. So as all this is going on, we do see a lot of personal suffering in the United States. People get desperate. There's no food, no housing, no clothing. People would live in shanty towns. When Hoover was president, they would live in Hoovervilles, which were these looking communities right here that you see. But just imagine a whole massive area of them like that. There were less marriages, children, and divorce, because if you couldn't take care of yourself, what made you think you could take care of somebody else? And also, what made you think you could take care of your partner? Suicides rise. And then you also see, obviously, a non-existent job market. Nobody is hiring because there's no jobs. And writers during this time, like John Steinbeck, he put down the political and social orders and problems that he saw during this time. And we also see a lot of images, pictures of, the struggle that occurred during this time as well. So, what do you do to kind of pull yourself out? We have the Keynes economic theory. So, Keynes was an economist and he tried to figure out a way to solve this problem. The government, and essentially what governments did was they tried to solve the problem one of two ways. Either if you were in this depression, governments would do nothing and hope for the economy to self-correct, which didn't work. Or two, governments took an active role, balancing national budgets and cutting spending, and people called for a revision of economic thought. And again, here enters Keynes. And he's an economist, and he said the problem is that there is not excessive supply, but that there is inadequate demand, meaning that we are not meeting the demands of the people. So what he did was he urged the government to stimulate the economy by lowering the interest rates. He told people to encourage investment, meaning don't be afraid to invest back into the stock market. He also said you need to have public works. You need to, start some sort of infrastructure, start rebuilding something. You need to redistribute incomes through a tax policy that would lead to reduced unemployment, meaning you need to fix the tax system, and that there would be an economic revival because of this. Now, he really didn't come into this economic theory full force until after World War II, or the US didn't really use this economic theory until after World War II. But with the New Deal and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the end of the global depression and most of the middle of it, he did use some of those ideas. So FDR applied ideas to stimulate the economy through policy, and he said that they had to do it, and the government was justified in intervening for social and economic welfare of the people, meaning that we, the government, are going to come in and help you because it's our job as the government. So he established these New Deal policies to prevent the collapse of banks, jobs, and farm subsidies. So he had jobs and farm subsidies. He gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively to get a fair price on their pay. There was guaranteed minimum wage, and we see the entrance of Social Security. Now, when you go into the U.S. history, you're going to realize that a lot of this was really only helping the white people. Okay, it really wasn't helping the minorities that existed, and not everybody felt this New Deal policies in effect. But that'll be when you look at U.S. history next year. So, challenges to the liberal order. So, this is going to be the entrance of our dictators, and it's important for you to know who are the key players when we begin to look at World War II. So we're first going to start with communism, Russia, and the Civil War, which we had already talked about this in the previous chapters. The Russian Communist Party will go into civil war from 1918 to 1920, and the communists will begin a red terror. And essentially what that is that they will begin arresting and trying and executing the white terror. So the red terror are those who are, pro-communist, and the white terror are those who are against communism in Russia. So July 1918, the Bolsheviks will execute Tsar Nicholas II and his family because they didn't want kind of like them to try to come back into power. And the White Terror were just as bad as the Red when it came to, executions and killings. And the White Terror tried to receive foreign support to end these communists, but they were unsuccessful because they just were not well organized. So the Whites were defeated by the Reds due to poor organization and support. War communism, no plans to change Russian economy with Vladimir Lenin. He will be the one in charge during this time. But there was this practice of war communism. And what it was nationalization. What they did in Russia was they nationalized it, which meant that they were going to get rid of all private property and that the government was going to control the banks, the industry, and other commercial properties. and that they would abolish private trade. So this was the idea of war communism. And by 1920, productions fell by 1/10 of its pre-war levels, pretty much indicating that this idea of war communism was ineffective. Okay, meaning that we're doing worse than we did before we even entered the war. And then spring 1921, Lenin calls for a reversal, obviously, of war communism since it's not working, and he will enter in a policy called the New Economic Policy. And what it did was it restored market economy and some private enterprise, meaning that some enterprises, some companies could, start up again. And these were really the small industries that would return to private ownership. And he said that peasants could also sell a surplus of their agriculture in the free market. So, pretty much kind of giving you just a little bit of a free market economy, but not totally a free market economy. And then we also see the establishment of technical schools. So, after Vladimir Lenin, we see Joseph Stalin come in as the new leader of Russia. And at first, he was a general secretary, and he was promoted, and he promoted socialism in the country. He was known as the Man of Steel, and in 1928, he established an unchallenged dictatorship, and he will be the one who will be in World War II. So again, important to know the key players and what they did. So he will establish a plan for rapid economic development. And he says the way to do this is that we have to industrialize. We have to emphasize on heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. And pretty much what this means is that we're going to industrialize and we're going to work on industrializing the country first before you even get a chance to enjoy, consuming any goods or enjoy buying things for yourself. So he pushes for resources and a high labor force. And he saw this as an alternative to market capitalism. Essentially, we're going to put the country first before we put individuals first. So, how do you do this? How do you industrialize so rapidly and make sure that everybody's being taken care of, being fed, and that kind of thing? He did it through something called the collectivization of agriculture. And what this was that he expropriated private land to create co-op farms. So the land that the government had taken, what they did is they spread it out to farmers. And what the farmers, and within like maybe 5-10 farmers, they cultivated the land. And the profits that they made, they were shared between the farmers there. But what this did was it helped to make sure workers were fed. So the people working in the industry and trying to industrialize, they got fed through this collectivization of agriculture. Okay? And then the 5-year plan was thought to be unrealistic because, again, like I said, we're going to industrialize. We're just going to work in industrialization, and you're not going to have consumer gratification. But instead of having consumer gratification, you're going to have full employment, which meant that even though you're not purchasing goods, everybody has a job still. And there's low cost of utilities and cheap housing and food. So you're being taken care of essentially. And the planned economy looked appealing. So what this means is that the way he did this, other countries saw this and they said, you know what? Maybe that works. Maybe what he's doing in kind of taking control of the economy, that's something that could be done. So the Great Purge, what this was a civil war within the Communist Party, because obviously not everyone agreed to it, and it was very harsh conditions you were working in. So you see an attack on the Bolshevik elites for treason because it seemed that they were speaking out against, what Stalin was doing. And what ends up happening is that there is a purge of 2/3 of the delegates. So 2/3 of the government is being purged, essentially purged, meaning cleansed, executed. And Russia's communism showed a viable political and social system. So, as strict and as stringent as it may sound, it worked. They industrialized and they were being successful in their industrialization. And you had a dictator who was in control of his country. So, other countries saw this and they thought maybe this is a possibility. So the other dictator that we see come about before World War II, but also a key player, was Benito Mussolini. And he created something called fascism. So what is fascism? Essentially, it's attractive to the middle class, to the rural populations, and to nationalists. So anybody who maybe is not rich, it's going to be attractive to them. And the fascists wanted to create a national community. This idea that we are a nation state, ethnic and racial, we are all the same. So what fascism did was it's going to honor the state. You're going to have devotion to your leader. It's a sense of ultra nationalism, meaning like it's the state, it's the country before the individual, always. And ethnocentrism and militarism, that we as an ethnicity are number one, we're the best, and that you have a strong military belief. Military life, large military establishments, and it's part of your public life. And again, the idea that fascism is subordinate, that fascism is before the individual. So there's subordination of the individual to the state. It's always what is best for the state before the individual in fascism. And so that means that fascism is going to be hostile to people who want to practice individualism, people who want democratic ideas, that freedom of speech and that kind of thing, and class-based visions. Those are going to be the people it is hostile to. So Benito Mussolini, he was the leader of the Italian fascism. And again, like we already know the definition, it emphasized nationalism and repression of socialists. And in 1922, he will become the prime minister and will form a new Italian government. So fascist government gains power through many laws. In these laws, we see the elimination of other political parties. There's no free press. There's no free speech. There's no free association. So you cannot do what you want here in this little country in Italy. You have to do what the government says because it's always what's best for the country. So there's no labor unions or strikes. There was this establishment of corporatism where organic entities through which different views came under the control of the state. So everything, again, state controlled. And racism and anti-Semitism were highly, highly exposed in this time. Unpatriotic, they said people who were anti-Semitic were unpatriotic, and there's no government employment or no intermarriage. So again, very strict and stringent control on your country. But I mean, this was working for him in Italy. All right, so the other key player that we also see in World War II is obviously Adolf Hitler. So with Hitler in 1921, he will become the chairman of the National Socialist Party, also known as the Nazi Party. And his aim is to get power legally after being imprisoned due to revolt. So he tried to revolt and gain power that way. It didn't work. He'll go to prison for some time. He'll write his book Mein Kampf there. He'll come out and he'll get power legally, and then he'll pretty much destroy the system that will give him power because he will become the dictator. So the Nazi Party had a broad appeal. It attracted the disillusioned who did not agree with the Treaty of Versailles, and especially the lower class. So the people who felt that, all those punishments were unfair, then we're going to attract those people. Those are the people that we want. He promises to end the misfortunes. He says, you know what? If you join me, then we can build a better Germany. He'll also stress racial doctrines, especially anti-Semitism. He'll say that it was the Jewish people's fault for World War I. But what he means by that is that during World War I, the U.S. Jewish bankers were the ones that provided the loans to the Allied forces. And so in this way, he blames the Jews. In 1932, it becomes the largest party in parliament, and he will be offered the chancellorship, and that's what he means. Once he accepts, that's pretty much where he had said that, we're gonna get in legally and then get rid of the system that got us in, because he will become the dictator after that. So the consolidation of powers, he used all means to impose his rule, and he will eliminate any working class and liberals. So anybody that he feels threatened, and he will officially take away constitutional and civil rights, and he'll outlaw political crime to create new ones. So pretty much he will rewrite the book in Germany to fit his agenda. And he'll prohibit strikes and lockouts because, again, that's a sense of revolting against the government as well. And he'll take control of police forces as well. So the German National Socialism, the racial state, and women and race. So, like we said, anti-Semitic and similar to this, and this is even a fascist country as well. If we look at the definition of fascism, they feel racially superior. Uh, Hitler wants to promote this racial purity. He uses something called eugenics to improve the quality of German race. And eugenics is just a pseudoscience. And what that means, pseudoscience, is that it's a fake science. It's not really scientific. So he said that there's no room for racial inferior of biological outsiders, again, hence meaning the Jews. And so he begins to launch this campaign because he sees there's low birth rates. And he begins to launch this campaign to increase birth rates. And he does it by encouraging marriages. He says, if you get married, we'll give you tax credits, we'll give you allowances, we'll give you loans, we'll give you all this stuff. He also rewrote divorce laws for husbands. So if a husband felt that his wife was sterile, then he could divorce her on that ground. And we also see the outlaw of abortions as well, and restricted birth control, all to again promote the birth rates of these Germans. So like I had mentioned with this Nazi eugenics, in 1933 we see a sterilization program begin to occur for hereditarily determined illness. So if there was any reason where they thought, you were, maybe mentally disabled or you were physically disabled, then they could sterilize you by law. And because then you would not be able to reproduce. And then in 1935, there was also government sanctioned abortions, especially, again, for the same reasons. If they saw in your hereditary line that you had, a lineage where somebody was, again, mentally ill, then you were able to have the woman have an abortion. And then, of course, we saw state-sponsored euthanasia programs for those seen as useless to society, physically and mentally handicapped. And then lastly, what you know as probably the most severe type of abuse with anti-Semitism, which was the prejudice against the Jews. You see religious dissent. Religious dissent is used as the way that we're going to determine you're a Jew. So we're going to look at your family history. If there was a Jew in there, then you're a Jew. And that's usually how it worked. You also had Nuremberg laws, which began to be laws that discriminated against the Jews. So, for example, Jews were no longer considered citizens. They could not marry or engage in sexual intercourse with somebody who was not a Jew. They could not, be or help if they were lawyers. They could not help non-Jews. They took away their wealth. They could not be civil servants. They lost land as well. So they also began to liquidate the businesses of the Jews. So all these things, all these laws were put into place. Obviously, restricting and constricting the lives of Jews in Germany, which spoke volumes about what they wanted with the Jews. Kristallnacht, this was the destruction of the Jewish stores and synagogues, and it was a night. It was a night where the German troops, the German police, went to Jewish businesses and broke the glass. Kristallnacht means night of broken glass, and they just destroyed the businesses. Again, a very physical view of how they felt towards the Jews. So 250,000 Jews will leave Germany by 1938 because they knew what was already happening to them in terms of the anti-Semitism, the severe anti-Semitism that was occurring. And you have to keep in mind that, nobody really knows what's going on in Germany except the Germans there. This isn't where today where you have the internet and the fast-paced mass media that occurs. So people hear stories of what's happening, but nobody knows for sure. So again, just keep all this in mind in terms of what happened after World War One and what was happening to start World War Two. And we'll see you guys next time.